Alrighty.
Okay, so good morning, everybody. My name is Sandy Marone. I'm the Senior Client Manager here at Pynchon, and thank you for joining us to learn about the new regulatory updates in regards to confined space here in Manitoba. We were roundtabling this as internally about, 6 months ago, Joey?
Yes.
Saying, we've been getting some questions from clients about confined space. We've been seeing some stop work orders come out, and some people were just completely blindsided by it. And we thought this might be a really good opportunity just to take a pause for a moment and just kind of let everyone know, kind of share some best practices, understanding what is a confined space and all that kind of stuff. So if you're just filtering in now, I've seen another bunch of people just pop in. The chat is a safe place. Put any and all questions in there. You can make them public, you can make them private. I won't call your name out, so don't worry about it. And we're gonna pick Joey's brain as we go through this. Myself, if I'm thinking of something, I like to understand the answer of it to try and build on that. So please put your questions in there, and it'll start some great conversations. So Joey, I'll just have you flip to the next slide.
Yes. So first off, before I start, am I able to?
You are the host.
I am the host. Okay. So still getting used to doing presentations online. If you see me pointing at my screen, please don't laugh. I have a tendency to I'm Italian, I talk with my hands.
Italian guys, just.
So my name is Joey Bellino. I'm the occupational hygienist at Pynchon.
I'm going to introduce you, Joey. So go to the next.
Oh gosh. Okay.
If we're going to flip through here. So
alrighty, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Joey Bellino is the project manager here at Pynchon in the Occupational Health and Safety Group. Joey holds a Bachelor of Science degree with a major in environmental science from the University of Manitoba. Joey also holds a Canadian Registered Safety Professional accreditation and recently completed the American Board of Industrial Hygiene. So he is now a certified industrial hygienist and like a phenomenal member on our team. We've been so lucky to have him. He has more than 18 years of comprehensive experience in managing occupational hygiene for a research-intensive university that spanned a whole variety of workplaces and projects and all kinds of interesting situations. And he also, with all the spare time that he has, he volunteers with the American Industrial Hygiene Manitoba local section on the executive board for the last 9 years. So Joey's seen it all, guys. He's phenomenal and he's great to work with. So if you have questions, again, pop them in the chat. This is a great time to start those open conversations about what the heck am I being expected to do in confined space now, what's the differences and what's been changing, because the last thing you need is, an inspector to come on site and blindside you by something. So this is really nice to kind of have a really good understanding of what you need to do now. So in saying that, I'm going to pass it off to Joey and he can kind of take us through the new regulations.
Alrighty, thank you very much, Sandy. So today I'm going to be providing we say an update, but more or less a review of the regulatory updates that were implemented, I guess, in September of 2019. But with COVID pretty much shutting everything down, or at least reducing occupancy in workplaces, it might have been sort of forgotten. A whole year sort of gone by. So we figured that this would be a great opportunity to sort of remind everyone of the updates or amendments that were applied to Part 15. So I'm going to go over the regulations and then perhaps discuss the types of confined spaces, and then some elements that you might want to consider when you're developing, or if you're planning on developing a confined space entry program within your organization. So, and then at the end we can open discussion and questions. But having said that, feel free to answer or ask any questions. I'll try and answer questions throughout the presentation. So Sandy, sort of blind, if you want to start.
I'm muted because I didn't want to introduce.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. So guys, we're going to be running a couple polling questions throughout this presentation because let's just see here. Oh, there we go. So everyone, I'll have you pull in here. We have a bunch of polling questions, and I think it's important for adult learning that we stay engaged and understand Where is your knowledge level at? This kind of gives us a bit of foundational levels to discuss what you guys may already know about confined space, and make sure you're paying attention, because I really want you guys to have some best practices after this. And I see lots of people weighing in here. We're almost I have we'll give it another 30 seconds here. And then we can end the polling. But I want you guys to try and stay engaged. I know it's so hard with, we're all zoomed out and webinared out and everything, but I want you to have some tangible things to walk away with at the end of this. So I'm going to end the polling and I'm going to share the results. And everyone was, Joy, can you see my results?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Okay, everyone's on board. A confined space is not always the basement. It can be located all over the building. So fantastic. Everyone right.
Yeah, even in buildings, throughout the buildings, and then even outside buildings. So you have other scenarios such as manholes, tanks and such that would be considered confined spaces. So am I able to close this, or?
Yeah, keep going. Yep.
Alrighty, so perfect. Okay, so what is a confined space? We can talk about, so we know that it can be a space that has a potential for developing a hazardous atmosphere, but it's not necessarily a cramped, tight, or confining space, unless, of course, there is an atmospheric hazard associated with it. It's not necessarily a space that only has safety hazards, such as electrical or mechanical or moving equipment, unless there's also that atmospheric hazard component as well. Although I mentioned atmospheric hazards, it's important to note that the hazards are not limited to atmospheric ones, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. As for types of confined spaces, the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, did a study quite some time ago. We use these studies because they're still pertinent or relevant today. In this study, in particular for types of confined spaces, it looked at where fatalities occurred. And tanks were the #1, representing about 17% of deaths. So what does this mean? It means that there's a significant danger that's presented when we're working within these spaces. Why would we care? Why do we care? Because the fact is that fatalities are still occurring in confined spaces. Even with all the recent rules and regulatory changes, it's one of the highest risk operations in any workplace. So we shouldn't be taking this lightly. And going back to our poll, I had mentioned, okay, well, I mean, you have tanks that can be considered confined space, and their configuration too, and how you enter. You have a horizontal, you also have your vertical confined, so lowering down with a tripod with a retrieval system into a manhole. Now, I want to briefly talk about some stats. These stats, again, were put together by NIOSH, and they're still relevant in today's confined space scenario. So about 50% of deaths in confined spaces occur due to oxygen deficiency. Oxygen deficiency is not the only potential hazard associated with confined space entry, but it's extremely significant since it represents half of the fatalities. So most of the deaths occurred in spaces where air testing was not performed prior to entry, or if testing was performed, it was perhaps performed incorrectly, or the equipment that was used was for monitoring, for example, was not properly calibrated. Stratification of the airspace wasn't taken into account, or the entire space wasn't sampled. So I'll talk about that later on with what goes into testing and where you should be testing and what you should be testing for. It's very simple to do, and one of the most important things to do in any confined space entry, and it is mandatory as it's mentioned in the regulation as well. So, how are we doing for any questions at all? No. Alrighty. So we'll talk about regulations. So the whole purpose of this discussion today. So first, I'd like to talk about our federal regulations. So which is There's been some proposed amendments to this regulation in federal workplaces, which is mentioned in Part 11 of the Canadian Occupational Health and Safety Regulation. The main changes include amending the definition of a confined space and adding a new definition called hazardous confined space. So we're talking about the federal regulation. The link to this is at the bottom of this slide, as you can see, as my hands are pointing to. It was published, actually, the amendment or the changes were published in June of 2020. And I read that the changes were supposed to be implemented as of January 2021, but I've recently visited the site and they haven't happened as of yet. Maybe I looked at the wrong site, but I don't think they've come into effect yet. So under the federal definition, we talk about confined space, which means, or as it's defined in that regulation, it means an enclosed or partially enclosed space that A, is not intended or not designed or intended for human occupancy, except for the purpose of performing work. B, has a restricted means of access and egress. C, may become hazardous to any person entering into it owing to its design, construction, location, or atmosphere, the materials or substances in it, or any other conditions relating to it. So going back up, excuse me, for discussing human occupancy, it's not defined really well. However, we get a bit of a guidance when referring to the building or fire code. There are basically three different scenarios for continuous human occupancy that we can use. The no-brainers are, if we were in a training room today or in a boardroom, those would be examples of spaces that are designed for human occupancy. Offices, like I mentioned, boardrooms, lunchrooms, washrooms, closets, storage rooms, vehicles, etc. However, there's also the not so obvious spaces that but still permit human occupancy. These areas could include mechanical rooms, boiler rooms, basements, electrical rooms, even elevator rooms. There's also the spaces that may be hazardous, even have a potential for hazardous atmospheres, much like we discussed in confined spaces, but because of their design under a specific standard, I'm talking about CSA or an ANSI standard, it allows people to enter, perform their work, and exit safely. Examples would be your chemical storage rooms or lab spaces. These have, for example, hinged doors, intrinsically safe lighting, ventilation that's provided from top to bottom in these areas, grounding and bonding that's provided. You also have your walk-in fridges or freezers or cooler rooms that have designs to allow someone to open from the inside. Also, perhaps IT or computer server rooms that use a fire suppression system that sort of snuff out oxygen, which could become hazardous. But having said that, there's also spaces that may fall under a completely separate standard or regulation. And these would include areas such as mines or underground tunneling operations.
Joey, I think listening to this, my first university apartment was a hazardous confined space in an attic of an old building that had raccoons living in the wall. So I'm wondering if that would classify as a hazardous confined space. Like,
well, the raccoons are certainly there would be a non-hazardous atmospheric hazard, I guess, vermins.
I complained about it, and then they trapped the hole, and this whole family died in the wall of raccoons, and it reeked for the rest of the semester. So I just
so that was even added to it. That was great.
I can't believe I lived in a confined space.
Yeah, so early in the morning. Okay, so the Manitoba Confined Space Regulation. So it was consolidated in 2006. That was created, has the document itself has an act and a regulation. So the first portion of it is your Workplace Safety and Health Act. And then the second part, which has several parts to it, is your regulation. So this was put together in 2006. Confined spaces is in part 15 of the regulation. And you can see the link here. I have it saved on my desktop, so I refer to it constantly. So as we mentioned, the regulation was amended in 2019, September. So this is the first, I do believe, since the last regulation update or amendment, which was in 2015, and it had related in relation to WHMIS. I remember that because I was part of redeveloping our WHMIS program at a previous employer that place that I worked at. So sorry, I just go on here. Lost myself. Before I go into the regulations, I wanted to briefly discuss or mention a standard or a best practice that I became aware of. It's the CSA Z1006 standard. And it's designed as a best practice, industry best practice. So each year workers are injured or killed during confined space interventions. So to better monitor the workers or level of safety, it's recommended to implement a worker management or work management program, including the evaluation and prevention of risks associated with confined spaces. So this standard, they call it a standard, I guess, but it's a reference tool. And perhaps it's something that you might want to consider in your workplace, or just as an added, in addition to the regulation. I'll give you some great tips. It's not mandatory. It's not referenced in the Canadian regulation, but nonetheless, it serves as a guide to optimize work management and defines proper behavior to adopt in enclosed areas when in hazardous and unsafe situations. So it's something that you might want to consider looking at. And I think you can just Google it, I do believe. So back to confined space legislation. So part 15, confined spaces. So what type of information are we going to find in the regulation? And basically the regulation is set up to help employers succeed in developing programs and making and providing the minimum amount of information or requirements to be compliant. So in part 15, it has it identifies the application. So we talk about, okay, this applies to confined spaces. And then it'll give you general requirements, and it'll list up a bunch of, and I'll be going over this a little bit later on. Also, requirements for entry into spaces. It discusses the standby workers or attendants, traffic hazards, purging and ventilating requirements or procedures to follow, control measures for hazards that are identified during the assessment, when entry is prohibited into these areas and what should be put in place to restrict entry, and then developing emergency response plans when dealing with certain types of hazardous confined spaces or confined spaces. So might have given away, not that I have, I do believe everyone knows, but the next polling question, Sandy, sorry, sort of pop it in on.
And me?
Yeah, our next polling question, do you want me to?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Sorry. Yeah.
Nope. Let's do it. Okay. So guys, how many in the 2019 provincial regulation amendment now includes a definition for how many types of confined space? And this is an interesting one. Is it just one type of confined space? Is there two types? Is there three types or four types? So I'll give you guys another 10 seconds here because I see about half of you have weighed in. And as you guys are all here trying to learn about this, it's interesting that you're trying to label things properly. There's lots of risk and liability for mislabeling confined space incorrectly. So this will kind of give us an understanding of what changed and how am I being expected to label it. So I'll give you 10 more seconds here. I have a couple more people left pulling in.
I thought left the chat, left the presentation. I'm like, oops.
Oh no, that's perfect. No, you're good. You're good.
Yeah.
I'm gonna share the results. It's really interesting, Joey. Ready?
Yep.
So we have people have said that there's 4 different types of confined space. now defined in the provincial regulations.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Maybe perhaps we might have in the wording of our question or poll. When looking at the 2019 amendment to the regulation, we in fact have two types of confined spaces defined. We have a confined space, which means an enclosed or partially enclosed space that, except for the purposes of performing work, is not primarily designed for or intended for that human occupancy component that we discussed earlier. It has a restricted means of access or egress. So that's now our confined space, and it has different requirements that are sort of set out in the regulation. And then much like that's how the federal regulation is moving towards now in the province of Manitoba. And I do believe there's some other jurisdictions out west here. I think Saskatchewan has the same sort of definition or types defined. We have a hazardous confined space, which means a confined space that is or may become hazardous to a worker who enters or is in the space due to the design. And again, there's some wording that's sort of that's borrowed or added from the federal regulation. So the design, construction, or atmosphere of the space, materials or substances in the space, the work activities or processes in that space. So what the workers are presenting or bringing into that space may cause it to sort of go from a confined space to a hazardous confined space. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. And also any other conditions within or related to the space. So there's two types, in fact. But I'm interested for discussion as to perhaps maybe in our wording, just with some thoughts on perhaps the thoughts of the three different types or four types that would be interesting.
Yeah, feel free to private message me in the chat if you want, and so I won't call you out. And we
no, and it's not then, yeah.
It's good to understand, what other types of confined space do people think there is? Because that's the whole reason we're doing this presentation today, is we found that there was a lot of confusion about it, and people were just trying to create a safe workplace and do it properly. And a lot of people just didn't understand. So feel free to message me and we can kind of flesh that out a bit.
Awesome. Okay, so the amended regulation clarified some of the required actions for the two types of confined spaces. So actions required for confined spaces and hazardous confined spaces. The employer needs to develop and implement safe work procedures. So these are the results of doing your assessment of the space and identifying hazards, and the safe work procedures are developed to address those hazards or control those hazards. So you want to develop, implement, but you also want to make sure that that workers are trained. These procedures will act as a training document, and also you want to ensure that there's worker compliance. It's one thing to develop these safe work procedures, but if they're not being followed, then you're no further ahead, and you're risking yourselves of being up for some issues. You also want to make sure that the procedures for with your risk procedures that have been designed or implemented, for example, for isolating or blanking out or locking out sources of energy, you want to make sure that those procedures address those issues. Also, you want to make sure that you have personal protective equipment that's provided that are part of these safe work procedures to your workers as well. It's also a requirement. Under the general requirements, you want to make sure that there's risk identification or some sort of assessment that's done. And then you want to have control measures. It also gives you some requirements to have control measures put in place, alternative work methods to sort of mitigate those risks or hazards, even involving space alterations. Will give you some requirements what should be done there. Important here, your testing and inspections. It'll give you the requirements, what's required there. Personal protective equipment, structural integrity, the requirements there for entry. And then even, as I mentioned before, the unauthorized entry, perhaps signage that needs to be put in place identifying these areas. So it goes on and on. And again, it's designed, the regulation's designed to sort of make, the employer or provide, best practices and information to be successful, sort of thing. It's performance-based. You meet those minimum requirements that are laid out in the regulation, but you can certainly go above and beyond. In my previous workplace, we had a program that we put in place back in 2001. First, we needed a lot of help. Actually, we had Pension helping us actually design it. And we met the minimum requirements, but in some areas we actually went above and beyond, which is perfectly acceptable. You may say, oh, it requires more work, but not necessarily. So I put this slide in saying actions not necessarily required for confined spaces, because if we're talking about entry permits and communication systems and standby workers and purging and ventilation, you're more or less talking about a hazardous confined space. So technically, yeah, it's not required if you have a labeled confined space. The component where the item, having an emergency response procedure, including rescue procedures and personal equipment, that would be applied to a hazardous confined space work and entry. As mentioned, all of the actions for hazardous confined space incorporate they add on to the confined space, plus having your emergency plan, having a rescue plan and equipment provided. Again, I want to say this, calling 911 does not constitute an acceptable rescue plan. It could be part of it, but you need to have something in place that includes your rescue team, having equipment on site. You're going to call 911.
I've seen that, right, Joey? We've seen people, we have seen that on some people's.
Yes.
Is the plan when things go bad is call 911. And that actually doesn't meet compliance. So it's really important to understand you need to have a good plan with 911 a part of it, because they can take a long time to get there sometimes.
Yeah, certainly. And your rescue procedure, your plan, emergency plan, you can hire or have someone as a second, provided. There's services, there's private companies that provide that sort of service, and that can certainly be part of your procedure as long as it's understood. And then again, obviously, you're going to have that component where you are going to call 911, but you're already going to have you need to have your rescue and emergency plan put in place. So just having it, on your permit saying in the event of an emergency, call 911, well, that's not your plan. That wouldn't be. And if something were to have happened and you had a safety and health officer come on site and do their investigation, and it was, part of that investigation, they're reviewing your procedures and plans, and they don't see anything under that, detailing your emergency response plan, your rescue procedures and such, you're not in compliance. So that would be an issue. So having said that, I'd mentioned entry permits. You want to have that in place as part of your what's required for hazardous confined space entry. In the event that you have drowning or engulfment hazards, you want to have controls put in place for that. And your air testing that you want to have, as a result of that air testing, you're going to have purging and ventilation procedures that where they're required. If the result of your air testing indicates, okay, well, we need to flush out this area, provide ventilation to push the atmospheric contaminants out, so that we're not being exposed to anything when we're entering, stuff like that. You want to have that in place. Any energy controls, so any sources of energy needs to be, blocked or tagged out, or you have to have procedures for that control. And then your standby worker or attendant, you want to have them, and I'll be going over this a little bit later on, and as part of your plan. First aid, trained in the work procedures of the entry permit system. Again, your emergency risk and rescue procedures, communication with the entrant and other assistants. Mentioning back in a slide previous that about 60% of the fatalities were people attempting rescue. It's very important here that we stress that if you have a standby worker that's part of your entry procedures in the hazardous confined space, they're not there to enter to attempt to rescue. They're there to summon or implement or activate that rescue plan and get those people on site and in position.
And actually, Joey, one of the attendees made a really good point to build on that.
Yep.
In addition to 911, only Winnipeg Fire provides confined space rescue. So rural emergency services do not offer this. So
That's very important. Thank you for that.
That's important to understand, right? Because I think a lot of the attendees have portfolios kind of all over Manitoba or all over Canada, and they're trying to manage it. And if you're in rural Manitoba, it's going to rely on you to do the rescue. They can't always do that for you.
Related, I guess, there was a fire in rural, just outside of the city limits, and there was a delayed response because of that. And the rural fire department, the response, which was a bit of an issue. So it sort of lends to exactly what you're saying there. That's an important point. Thank you. Even something to help you along in defining your spaces, actually, you could use a flow chart and simple questions asked, top box, is the space designed in construction for continuous human occupancy? If it's yes, perhaps it's not a confined space. So then you can further go down and say, if you say no, it's not designed for continued human occupancy, you might want to say, okay, might this space become hazardous to a worker who enters or is in the space? And again, break it down further and say no, then it's a confined space. And yes, you'd sort of, graduate to a hazardous confined space, and then you'd be looking at requirements for dealing with those spaces. And this could be part of your initial assessment of your spaces within your facilities.
So Joey, quick question.
Yes.
Would you suggest having 2 entry permits, one for non-hazardous confined space and one for hazardous confined space?
Well, technically, okay, this might be part of your going above and beyond the requirements, because technically you don't need a permit for a confined space, but when you're doing your assessment, and it's good practice, I would suggest, you do your assessment and you have, okay, in your assessment, you have some sort of permit before entering, even if you have a confined space, that you identify that, assessment was done. And as a result of that assessment, this was determined to be a confined space and not a hazardous confined space based on this. And then your permit for your hazardous confined space is based on this assessment. Does that answer your question?
Hopefully the attendees, I have someone raising their hand. I'm actually going to let this person talk, if that's okay, just so that
Sure.
Okay, Michelle, I'm going to let you talk there if you want to mute yourself, and you can just ask away, because I want to make sure everyone, any questions you have, let's get them fleshed out.
Joy, maybe a better question would be is not so much the permit, but would it be better to have 2 different sets of assessments, a risk assessment for a hazardous confined space and a risk assessment for a non-hazardous confined space? Because there's just, there's so many, there'll be so many not applicables for the spaces that are non-hazardous.
Yeah.
And one of the examples would be our interstitial spaces above our operating room theaters. They're not designed for human occupancy, but they are designed for maintenance crews to regularly and routinely enter and exit to perform maintenance tasks. So I was just wondering if there would be a benefit to separating that for simplicity's sake, or just have it all in one. And
no, I think that's a great idea, actually, to have them separated, because you have crawl spaces too that are considered confined spaces, but not necessarily a hazardous confined space, but they still present some hazards nonetheless. So doing having an assessment done for each of those, even if you have it labeled as a confined space, and you have your other ones labeled as a hazardous confined space, I think it's an excellent practice to have that in place. So no, that's great point, and thank you for bringing that up. I think that's really good.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Michelle.
Better mute me.
I've had some other people throwing some context in. Please, you guys are seeing it all out there too. And actually, Michelle also let us know that some rural emergency workers are trained. The Manitoba Volunteer Fire Department was trained in confined space rescue by Husky. Well, it is nice to see that that knowledge is being put back out into the market for people.
Yeah, and it's kind of scary because like we talked about, confined spaces are certainly not, um, found in basement areas of buildings. And especially in rural areas, there's a lot of different confined spaces that a lot of people, that should be considered in place. Unfortunately, there's been a number of fatalities associated with rescue and cleaning out rail cars that were thought to be purged of nitrogen dioxide. Yeah, so it's important that that these areas that there's plans put in place for rescue or work in these spaces. So I'm going to go on to the next slide if that's okay, or
Sure.
if there's any other questions.
I just have one question here. It says NO2 ? I'm guessing that's nitrogen oxide.
Nitrogen dioxide, yeah.
Yeah. Maybe clarify. I mean, you're talking about that rail car where like 3 people ended up passing away, right? Where they went in to save.
Yeah, well, typically when they'll purge a space, clean out the tank, and use nitrogen dioxide. I might be getting myself mixed up, but it displaces nitrogen. Sorry. So what happens is it created an oxygen deficient environment. So the first person went down, was affected and fell, and then the second person noticed this person at the bottom of the tank went in. I think unfortunately there was two people that had died prior to recognizing the issue. So.
I thought there was a third person and the fourth person didn't. And anyway, terrible situation, right?
Yeah, certainly.
Well, when you see them in trouble,
Yeah.
and ended up succumbing to your own fatality.
Yeah. So, does that answer or question?
I think so. I do have one more question. This is great, guys. Keep them coming in. Would a space that partially matches the definition, such as not meant for continuous human occupancy, but has the means of egress as a set of stairs, be considered a confined space?
Okay, so it's not permitted for continuous human occupancy?
Would a space that partially matches the definition? So we all have these spaces in the facilities, trying to figure out, is this confined space or not? So it partially matches as it's not meant for continuous human occupancy.
Okay.
As the means of egress, as a set of stairs.
It could certainly still be a confined space based on the initial definition, I guess, with human occupancy, but also, again, doing your assessment. There's some other hazards that may be associated with that space. Communication, working alone in that area, and again, I guess the steps or ladders that permit the be situated, stuff like that. There's parts of the assessment that'll further define or help you define that space. But I would suggest if it's not for or other items provided for that may become an issue if you're continuously occupying that space without proper procedures or plans put in place.
What additional documentation is required for non-hazardous confined space or restricted space? Identification to workers is required. Just an assessment that shows is that it's not.
Well, internally, you could provide, again, if you're doing your hazard assessment, have some sort of document that sort of, ticks off what you're looking for to determine what the hazards present, and then if there is such hazards, or if there isn't, you've identified, okay, you look for this, this, and this, and you did provide air testing or monitoring to determine that there wasn't any atmospheric hazards, perhaps. So this is one of those things that internally you can develop in addition to what, the regulation will provide you with that information as to what requirements, what you should be doing as far as for, as part of that assessment. Initial assessment, that risk identification or hazard assessment. And that'll help you develop perhaps your own documents or document or form that you can present. Again, it's a matter of what did I do to determine that this was space or a confined space or a hazardous confined space. So it's important as part of your program to have that sort of plan that includes your risk assessment, and then based on that risk assessment, help mitigate any hazards that are identified or prove that, okay, well, as a result of this assessment, we determined that there wasn't any hazards in this confined space. We'll talk about plans and how they, a little bit further on, we'll be discussing. It might be a little bit helpful in answering some of these questions, but they're excellent. It's
Yeah,
great
for sure.
to
So
have
just
this
to
dialogue.
clarify, so if there's just an assessment that shows it is non-hazardous, or can you do an assessment that shows it's non-hazardous and do some worker education? Is signage still required?
Yeah, you still want to identify your confined spaces and your hazardous confined spaces. It's important because based on that signage initially, because you're gonna have people, you want to have that sort of stop. Okay, well, this is a confined space or a hazardous confined space. What are the procedures that are put in place? Because you're still going to have some entry procedures or restrictions in these areas.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, so we're getting closer to the 50-minute mark, so I just want to make sure that we have some time to
Keep
go over
going.
some-
Yeah,
so-
I'll let them pile up for a
Awesome.
little bit. I'll
All right.
interrupt you when I
So
need to.
confined space hazards. We have our atmospheric hazards and non-atmospheric hazards. I mentioned I've not sort of presented the atmospheric hazards, and now we have the non-atmospheric hazards. So I'm going to lead into the next poll question here, Sandy, when we're talking about the difference. So if you just want to.
I most certainly can.
You're awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay. Number 3. So guys, what types of atmospheric hazards are considered in a confined space? So select all of them that you think might apply to have something labeled as a confined space. Let me tell you, animals, raccoons, they can be hazardous living in an attic.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, it's saying it's only allowing 1. Thank you for letting me know that. Sorry about that, guys. That was set up incorrectly. You should have been able to select a whole bunch of them. So just select 1 for right now. I do apologize. You should have been able to select multiple ones. That one was set up incorrectly. So that's good to know. Sorry about that. So I will, I'll let you guys just pick 1 for right now, and then we'll let you pull in here. I'll end the poll. Sorry about that. I feel bad. So the winner was oxygen deficiency or enrichment. But there should have been multiple answers that you should have picked. It would have been flammable gas, toxic chemicals, oxygen deficiency or enrichment, and vapors. That would have been the correct answers if you had been able to select multiple things. Animals actually are not considered an atmospheric hazard, although they probably should be.
And we'll discuss how they factor in on the hazards in a space. So they do factor in, just not necessarily as an atmospheric hazard, but they are certainly considered. Previous employment, we had some issues in some of our spaces with raccoons as well. And they would leave presents every morning when we do our inspections for asbestos and stuff like that. So they let their presence be known for sure, mark their territory, so to speak. Alrighty, so I'm just gonna go. Why won't it let me advance? It should. Okay, so atmospheric hazards, again, yes, oxygen deficiency or enrichment, flammable gases and vapors, toxic chemicals. So those are your 3 or 4 if you separate the gases and vapors for flammables. So when talking about oxygen deficiency or enrichment, I first want to talk about, we're looking at the scenarios where there's too little or too much oxygen. The normal content of oxygen in air is 20.9%. So the limits for what the definition considers an atmospheric hazard when it comes to oxygen is percentages less than 19.5 and above that upper percentage of 23%. So now 19.5 is not a huge drop, and we're not going to die by this reduced amount, but it's very important to note that it's a good indication that something is causing the oxygen to drop. So there may be potential for it to drop even further to unsafe or fatal levels. Over 23, there's an increased risk of fire explosion. So now talking about symptoms, and again, there's that range 18 to 23%. Within that range, technically no symptoms. But again, having said that, everyone's different in their physical makeup and how they're affected by these situations. 12 to 16% generally, there's an increased pulse rate, loss of fine motor control. 10 to 12, rapid pulse, nausea, headache, difficulty in breathing, lack of coordination. And then there's a 6 to 10% where you're lethargic and loss of consciousness, perhaps. Excuse me. And then less than 6% will result in death. We're talking about causes of oxygen deficiency. Again, we're talking about that displacement. So nitrogen, our ambient air is made up of oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, argon, helium. So anytime that you get, and they're all balanced in that percentage. So oxygen sits in at that 20.9%. Anytime you have these other inert gases that sort of are fluctuating or lessening, it causes a shift in all that percentage. So you get these, minor blips of, percentage points that go up and down. So if you have an environment where you have a higher nitrogen content, it's going to reduce or displace that oxygen, cause that deficiency. Also, improper purging and ventilating, you'll create could create an oxygen deficient environment. And then even some of the operations that you're performing, welding, combustion processes and stuff like that, fires for certain human activity, microbial activity, and such. Your oxygen enriched environment, you're 23% and up. Again, we talk about oxygen toxicity, increased risk of fire, explosive atmosphere that's created. You never want to use pure oxygen to ventilate a space. When we're talking about flammable or fire hazards, it's pretty straightforward. Prior to going in, we should always know what the contents of the space are in this. In other words, the supply lines, the work to be done in the space. This will tell us perhaps if there's any accumulating flammable, combustible, explosive potentials. For example, if the space is typically operating under natural gas, then there will be flammable supply lines going into the space. If the contents of the space are considered flammable combustible, we know this perhaps from reading labels that are provided or the SDS or safety data sheets. The worker could also bring something in, or their activities in this space could create or generate an accumulation of flammables, vapors, for example, spray painting operations or welding and cutting. Talking about your flammable mixtures, we're talking about the lower explosive limits, which is your LEL, which is the lowest concentration of a gas or vapor that will burn in air. And then below this limit, below your LEL, it's too lean to burn. So there's you have your too lean to burn below your LEL, and then you have your upper explosive limit, which is above that mixture. It's too rich. So in between, you have your combustible or flammable explosive range, and in that area. So you want to make sure, as a result of when you're doing your monitoring, you're 10% below that LEL. Some LELs for materials such as methane, you have those shorter ranges, and then others like hydrogen, you have a wider range. So there's different hazards that are associated with the different materials. So that's part of your monitoring. You want to make sure that you're identifying, if those hazards are presented in the space and what you're going to do to mitigate those hazards prior to entry and continuous work in this space. You also want to consider your sources of ignition. When talking about toxic atmospheres, here we're thinking, okay, what could we be exposed to, and what are the concentrations in the air that are currently, presented that could be that could affect or adversely affect us. So these are considered your atmospheric contaminants. So your atmospheric, it's important to note that atmospheric contaminants are not necessarily the same as atmospheric hazards, but they will lend into that, and I'll talk about it a little bit further. But before that, I just want to perhaps delve into the acute and chronic effects that we should consider with these toxic materials. And we're talking about acute and chronic. Here we're using these terms to delineate between the effects of basis on severity or duration. So for acute effects, we're talking about usually occur rapidly as a result of short-term exposures and or of short duration. I'm getting a sign here on my screen to say reboot or reboot later. So I'm sorry, I will reboot later. That's odd. I apologize for that. We're talking about chronic effects generally occur as a result of long-term exposure and or of longer duration. Further to that, we talk about our occupational exposure limits versus our immediate dangers to life and health, or our IDLH. So in general, occupational exposure limits represent the maximum airborne concentration of a toxic substance to which a worker can be exposed over a period of time without suffering any harmful consequences. So in the province of Manitoba, we use the 2019 version of the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, the ICGIH, TLVs, and that we use for our occupational exposure limits. When we're talking about IDLH, OSHA has a definition. So this is an atmosphere that poses an immediate threat to life that would cause irreversible adverse health effects or would impair an individual's ability to escape from a dangerous atmosphere. So it's an acute sort of situation where we have to consider that. So going back to atmospheric contaminants. So for an atmospheric contaminant to become an atmospheric hazard, it must have the potential to be at a level in the space to be an acute hazard that poses an immediate threat to life. In other words, an IDLH. So I hope that's helpful in determining that. So there are many types or many toxic gases that may cause unconsciousness or possible death in a matter of minutes. So these gases are often not seen, and that even compounds the issue. And I'll go into a couple of slides here. Carbon monoxide, for example, we all know about. It's colorless, odorless, tasteless, and poisonous. And the sources for carbon monoxide are your internal combustion engines. Your carbon dioxide, again, this is also one material that will displace oxygen. Again, if it's thrown out of that percentage it's present in our atmospheric or ambient concentration. It's also odorless and it's a heavier gas. And I'll mention when we're talking about testing what that means, heavier gas. It'll tend to settle out at your lower levels towards the floor. Nitrogen dioxide, it's pungent, it has an acidic odor. Sources are a product of gas or diesel engines. Hydrogen sulfide, we all know about this. It has that rotten egg sort of type smell. Its sources are found in sewers, manure pits, and it's a product of decaying matter. So understanding the space and surrounding activities and also reading the appropriate safety data sheets will help us in determining, okay, what those, what these materials are and what their occupational exposure limits might be, and provide us with information in dealing, when it comes to, ventilating or purging the area, stuff like what to be wearing in these types of environments. Other potential hazards. So once your confined space status and potential atmospheric hazards have been determined, we should not forget about the non-atmospheric hazards. So here's a slide that presents a bunch of different non-atmospheric hazards that should be considered when you're doing your assessment. And they include access egress restrictions, corrosion on materials, good indication of entanglement, insects or vermin. That would probably include your raccoons. Microbiologicals, any molds in that area, physical obstructions, Supply line discharges, visibility is certainly something to consider. Engulfment or entrapment, drowning, falling, ladder. You can see noise, stored energy, and stuff like that.
Raccoons would definitely fall into there.
Yes, definitely. Just to give you a, most of the information I provided you previously, you can find again. Just want to mention the workplace safety and health regulation, but the act as well. Now, I want to get into our next section, and before we do that, I want to present our next poll question. So, what is the first step in creating a confined space program?
So this was a tricky one when we put it together. So we were trying to think about, people here, they're thinking, what is the first step? Okay, I need to start creating a confined space for my facility, and I want to make sure everyone's working safely. And so what is the first step in creating a confined space program? Assessing the spaces to determine if they qualify, conduct a hazard assessment, putting confined space signs on all suspect spaces first. So label everything so no one goes in there, and then figure it out after. Developing safe work procedures to work in the space, or implementing hazard controls. So I'll give you guys here another 20 seconds here. We'll let you answer the poll questions.
Yeah, I may have to apologize because technically there could be 2 correct answers.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I do apologize for that. So if you're having troubles with that, making me think a little bit more. You can be like, what the hell kind of question? Maybe a suggestion would be, better poll.
Well, yeah, you will have the ability to weigh in on this after as to how we could have improved. Maybe we could have done polling a little bit better, but we made this one tricky on purpose because we wanted people, because sometimes you don't really know where to start. So we thought it might be a good place to start. So I'm going to wrap up the polling here, and I'm going to share the results.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I figured,
Yeah. So 65% said assessing the spaces to determine they qualify, and the remainder said conduct a hazard assessment.
So yeah, assessing the space first off to see if they qualify would be your first. So technically the way it's written, but if you had answered a hazard assessment, you're not necessarily incorrect. Sorry.
Yeah, and so that was actually, as I'm learning this as well, that was my question for Joey as we these polling questions. As I said, what if I'm looking at confined space and there's something dangerous in there that could take my head off or something, or a dangerous gas or something, and I'm trying to look in there to see is this a confined space? How do people handle this? And that was the exact conversation that we had as well.
And I think it's important that we should add that anytime you have, even if you've deemed let's say a crawl space that doesn't have any mechanical pipes or equipment running through it, it's pretty much open sort of soiled space beneath a building. And you've labeled as a confined space because there's no continuous human occupancy, so it's labeled as such. But let's say you have some sort of sewage discharge in that area that presents a hazard. You know what I mean? So it's caused so there should be always an assessment done. And that sort of lends back to Michelle, just having your confined spaces and your hazard confined spaces, doing your assessments to make sure that they are what they were, the situation or the space of the atmosphere is what it was before, and nothing's changed. So just to be err on the side of caution. All right, thank you. So going a little bit further into elements of a confined space entry program. So here we're going to give you some tools or some information as to what might your program look like, or some suggestions that are pretty much in accordance or required under the regulation. You want to have plans put in place. So the plans will be based on the initial assessment of that space. This may include the development of procedures to adjust those hazards that were identified or that are based on that assessment. So the procedures for the control that the hazards or that were identified in the assessment, you want to have that part of your plan. could be used for 2 or more spaces or of similar construction and same hazards. So this is important to note that when you're developing these plans and you have one space that's very similar in its construction or design and hazards identified, you have 2 spaces with the exact same hazards and construction. You don't want to do, one for, you can use it for both spaces based on that. So you can apply it based on similar construction or hazards. The plans for this particular space can apply for this particular space. So you're not having to do individual safe work procedures for every space. It can apply to multiple spaces based on your assessment that says that they're similar construction hazards. The plans also want to be cited or are incorporated into your permit system in dealing with hazard confined spaces, or if you're using permits for your confined space. They also need to be periodically reviewed as often as necessary to ensure that they're still adequate. When would you do it? Based on legislation, they say safe work procedures or plans should be reviewed at least every 3 years, or if regulations change, that would be a cause for review. Also, some other causes for review might be unfortunate situations where there may have been an accident or a near miss. As part of your investigation, you always want to look at, okay, well, what safe work procedures were put in place to mitigate these hazards or risks, and are they working? And then from there, you might identify, okay, well, maybe we have to revamp our safe work procedures or plans, or perhaps you identify that workers weren't properly trained or there weren't following procedures. So there's things that you can identify that make those reviews important. All right. So part of that plan, some of the provisions that are included, you've got your permits, your duties of workers, on-site rescue procedures, the equipment and methods of communication related to rescue, personal protective equipment, clothing and devices, isolation of energy and control of materials movement, your attendance, adequate means of access egress, air testing, adequate procedures for working in flammable environments, ventilation and purging. So all those are included in that plan, or those procedures that could, require a plan to put in place. So before I go any further, our next polling question. So here we're talking about, what are the repercussions or consequences of mislabeling a confined space? So Sandy?
Yeah, I will launch it. And so what are the repercussions of mislabeling confined space? So you go out there and you label everything, right? And we actually see this quite often when we do confined space audits, where we see things mislabeled. And so select all that apply. So when erring on the side of caution, it satisfies requirements outlined in the regulation. So when in doubt, label a confined space just to be safe. Or it could result in unnecessary precautions and costs. You could have additional time spent in safety protocols that are unnecessary. You might give people a false sense of security because everything else is labeled and this space isn't. It could result in a stopped work order, or you could have a fatality could result from an unidentified hazard. And I'm thinking maybe this one was set up improperly as well, where can you only select one on this one, guys? Because I see people only selecting. Yeah.
So there's multiple.
I'm sorry about
creates a lot of conversation too, just because of there's a tendency that go out and just label everything. So what happens there is that you may have mislabeled and you have a situation where you haven't identified all the hazards, or that time wasn't. So you have that false sort of sense of security that okay, well, there was an assessment done, but was it done properly, sort of thing. So yeah. So yeah,
I was just going to apologize again. This one was set up where you can only select one, and you should have been able to select multiple ones. So I'm gonna end the poll, Joey, and then you can explain what the right answers were.
Okay.
So can you see what people pick?
Yeah.
Kind of explain what the correct answers were.
Yeah, and I think for the most part, I think anything that was what was discussed here or what was answered, I think everybody probably would have answered altogether if they could select all that apply. So the results, unnecessary precautions and costs. Yeah, there is significant, I would assume costs that are incurred by, labeling a space, as well as, result in a stop work order. You're working in a space that you're thinking is confined space, and it's actually, in fact, a hazardous confined space, and something happens and can result in a stop work order. And of course, a fatality could result from unidentified hazards.
So just to clarify, guys, the only one on here that is not correct is to just label everything. That actually that does not meet regulation. So don't just err on the side of caution and over label.
Yeah.
Can create a lot of problems as well, and extra cost. We see that quite a bit, actually.
Yeah.
They're having to bring in a whole team of extras, rescue people and safety precautions. Or if someone that's course certified like us show up and we see something labeled as a confined space, now we have to bring two of us, and we have to take extra precautions that maybe were not even required, right, at that extra cost. So it's really important that if you're going to label spaces, it's done correctly, because you could end up saving a lot of money if as long as it's been assessed properly.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Alrighty, so going back to entry permits, I want to sort of mention this just because we talk about that and okay, well, what goes into an entry permit? So in accordance with, it's laid out in section 15.4 of the regulation. And the entry permit must contain the following: the location of the hazardous confined space, which you're entering, name of each worker who will enter the confined space, the reason for that worker's entry, the date and time during which the permit is valid, type of work being done, any safe work procedures for entering, being in, and leaving a confined space should be included, referenced in that permit. And then all hazards to safety and health of the worker identified by that risk assessment. So that goes into your permit. And just to further go on to some of those other provisions that were identified initially with the plan, we talked about the attendance, and I want to hammer this home too, is for each confined space entry, an attendant will be stationed outside and near the entrance to that hazardous confined space, in constant communication with all workers inside the space, using means of communication described in your relevant plan. Provide a device for summoning a rescue response, providing assistance from outside the space to the entrance, again, outside. And they must be first aid certified. The attendant is not to enter the hazardous confined space. Again, just to mention that again. When we're talking about personal protective equipment, we should be qualifying that, okay, especially when it comes to respirators. So you have your two types of respirators, and that's based on, again, on your assessment of that space. This is where you're talking about, what environment am I in? Am I in an environment where there's atmospheric contaminants in that space and they're being controlled, but they can be controlled with an air purifying respirator, that's equipped with the appropriate cartridge or filter media that will remove that specific contaminant from the air. Or, and I want to stress this, is that you would not be using this, an air purifying, I'm pointing at my screen, sorry, air purifying respirator in an environment where you have oxygen deficiency or enrichment. So that would be not an area that you would be, especially oxygen deficiency, you would not be using an air purifying respirator. In fact, if you're permitted to enter into that space, I say that because some, you may farm this out to an outside consultant or company to do work in your confined spaces. So they may be, they'll use in an oxygen deficient environment, an atmosphere supplying air system sort of thing that provides fresh air from an independent source. For example, you'd have your airline respirator or your SCBA, self-contained breathing apparatus. So when you're using these types of personal protective equipment, the SCBAs and the airline, you need to be trained properly in the use of it. And, with that comes in, knowing the warning signs as to when to exit a space when your oxygen is low on your when you're using self-contained breathing apparatus sort of thing. So those are things that you just can't say, okay, well, we have an oxygen deficient environment, we're just going to throw someone in there with an SCBA. That should not be happening. There should be a certain significant amount of training involved and understanding. We had mentioned.
I want to jump in real quick here. I've had about 3 people ask me, can I get copies of these slides or something after? Absolutely. This whole thing is being recorded right now, and it's going to be posted to the Pynchon website probably in about 2-3 days. If you want me to send them to you, the link after it's posted, just shoot me a message in the chat or whatever, and I'm happy to jot down your name and email address. Maybe just send me your email address when you reach out, and I am more than happy to send you the link when it gets posted.
Awesome. No, good. So when we're talking about air testing, we want to make sure that we're using calibrated monitoring. Like the monitoring equipment that we're using is appropriate for the hazards identified in the assessment, and the equipment is calibrated. So you do your sort of bump test, your daily calibration, but then you also have your annual manufactured sort of calibration. So those are things that you want to make sure that if you have this equipment that you're using to do air testing or to help identify your spaces or use when you're working in these spaces, that they're properly calibrated and they're working properly. So, and then when you're doing your sampling, you want to make sure that the results of every sample is recorded. Note if you're using continuous monitoring, this should be done in a regular time frame, usually every 15 minutes, and it needs to be recorded as well. So why do we test? Just to break it down, basically, we cannot trust our senses to detect all hazards. So there's some materials that are odorless, some that will cause olfactory fatigue, meaning that, in concentrations for a prolonged period of time, we can no longer, smell them. So that's a significant danger in being in an area where you can no longer smell something, because we should also note that odor thresholds can be much greater than your actual, occupational exposure thresholds too. So that's something to keep in account when you're doing your monitoring. Chemicals with poor warning properties should also be considered. And it's also a legal requirement under the regulation that it's required to do air testing to help in your assessment of that area to determine hazards. When to sample, this is important upon opening the space. So you're not going to stick your head down in and reach down. You want to maybe, in the event of, in this illustration here, have a line that you're able to drop your monitoring device or equipment, because we had spoken about that stratification of the air, where you're going to have some materials that are more dense or less dense than air. So less dense, you'd have them a little bit higher up towards the ceiling of that space. Mid-range is what you're equal to air, your carbon monoxide, and then your lower towards the floor, your heavier gases will accumulate. So you want to do that sort of testing initially to determine, before we enter in, or even to do that initial sort of assessment at the base of that ladder. We don't have any any issues with any oxygen displacement, LELs, or typically what you're first looking for is your H2S concentrations, LEL, carbon monoxide, and LELs. So pre-entry, before each permit period, or unoccupied or unattended. So you'll continue with this when you have it, you're working in an area that it's, you're doing permitted work. Anytime you leave that space for a period of time, you want to reestablish that sampling. If that was part of your plan, based on the fact that it's a hazardous confined space, you want to reestablish that sampling before entering in, and then that period of time that it's been unattended. So you want to do that. Any continuous work that you're doing that may generate or release chemicals or use or an atmosphere in that space, you want to do continuous sampling while that worker is in the space doing that work, to make sure that the atmosphere is not changing based on your initial assessment with that air testing. You also want to, I guess, just to
wait, I have someone that raised their hand here.
Oh, sorry.
No, don't apologize.
All right.
Allow them to talk. So it looks like they're just looking for some clarification on something.
Is that Nazmo?
Hey Zoe, how are
Hey,
you?
buddy, how are you?
I'm good. I just have a quick question about the monitoring. Is it still required 20 minutes interval to record the confined space gas monitoring? That the sequence that was initially before was required?
It should be done continuously, yeah, to establish that. I wasn't aware of the 24 minutes.
No, it's 20 minutes was.
Yeah. So I would say every 15 minutes or whatever, if that's what you're doing for continuous monitoring.
Right.
Yeah.
So he's still doing the same, right?
Yeah.
Pretty much. Okay. And keep record of those documents. Does it require it still with the new update, or
You should record, yeah.
I should? Okay. Okay, awesome, man. Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. How's the family? Everyone's good? Good.
That's okay.
Okay, all right. Awesome. So thanks, Nazmo. So recognize the gases. Again, I had mentioned this earlier, vapors can be heavier or lighter than air. Your lighter than air or your methanes, for example, same as air, carbon monoxide, heavier than air, you've got your hydrogen sulfides, carbon dioxide, for example. So you want to test the entire space. As far as for training, you have your general training that we discussed earlier about, by a person with, it should be conducted by a person with adequate knowledge, developed perhaps in some workplaces that have joint health and safety committees, and regularly reviewed. Again, we had identified reasons why you would probably regularly review based on, changes in regulations, unfortunate incidents, near misses, and such. And you want to maintain a record of that training. So when we're talking about plan specific or, perhaps safe work procedures, the workers must be trained in those as it relates to the work plan or safe work procedure. So there's that worker involvement. I could sit in an office and develop safe work procedures based on information given. They may not be, completely accurate in the sense that I'm not doing the physical work and knowing exactly what some of the other, issues that should be brought up or should be addressed in your safe work. So there's also, as part of that, the act and regulation, there needs to be that worker involvement to the cooperation between employer or supervisor and worker. So if in fact you're developing these plans or procedures, you want to make sure that the people are trained and those documents become training documents. So safe work procedures, there's that understanding, sign off on it. And this is in addition to your general training. Your general training could be your, new worker orientation, stuff like that. This is in addition to that type of training. If in fact, when we're dealing with on-site rescue procedures, you want your on-site rescue procedures developed and they're ready for implementation. You want to make sure that the personnel are trained in the procedures. They have their first aid and CPR, for example. If there's rescue equipment involved for use, they're actually trained in using that. It's updated training. Again, calling 911 initially as part of your plan is not a procedure. It could be incorporated as a result into it, but you need to have a on-site rescue procedure put in place when dealing with hazardous confined spaces. So when we're talking about equipment, it must be readily available and inspected as often as is necessary to ensure that it's in good working order. And this should be done by a knowledgeable person. The inspections must be recorded and referenced in that permit that you're using. So as part of that information in the permit, you need to, if you're using rescue equipment, it needs to be documented that it's been inspected and such and such date, and it's okay to use.
So Joy, I have a question.
Yes.
We have this conversation all the time in asbestos and hazardous materials as to, you said it has to be done by a knowledgeable person. What does that mean? Like, is there a course to take? Is there, Google search? Because we get that question all the time, right? Like who can audit this?
Okay, well, someone, I guess, knowledgeable.
You want to answer? I know that's why.
It is, yeah. When you're talking about asbestos, I mean, there's asbestos awareness training. There's operational maintenance and operations training that's provided that'll give you that knowledge. Yeah, it's a good question. A knowledgeable person, someone that's received or certified training in those areas, for use of personal rescue. For example, I did some rescue training back in the day at the fire office of the Fire Commission in hazardous materials operations training. So it allowed me to to provide additional training as such. It certified me. So good question. I don't know if I answered it or not, but
That's why I ask you the hard questions. Yeah.
yeah.
Because everyone's thinking we're doing good for time. We still have about 10 minutes and we've been answering all the questions as we go. So I think we're doing
Awesome. Okay, so in the event of a release of hazardous substances or contact with electrical energy, or if there's a situation where you have a lot of moving parts of equipment or there's free flowing material, or there's like a drowning or engulfment hazard, you want to have an action plan put in place. So something that specifically mentions, for example, blanking or disconnecting piping, de-energizing those energy sources and locking out, but also states that where it is not practical in circumstances for technical reasons, controls can be achieved by other adequate means. The regulation, the Act always talk about what's reasonably practicable. So as long as you can you have a plan in place, not necessarily, again, the regulation and the Act will give you in terms of, I guess, of the requirements, what you can do to achieve that, what's reasonably practicable. So methods for energy isolation, again, I mentioned it previously, the lockout, tag out method, bleeding and blanking. When you're dealing with pneumatic and hydraulic lines, you want to flush or bleed those lines out. Disconnecting, you have moving equipment. This is moving equipment. You have belt drives present. Securing moving parts by use of latches, chains, and blocks. And then you want to make sure that you have, again, comes back to record keeping. So anything you've done as far as for, records, as far as for assessments, work plans or procedures, training, entry permits, inspections, tests, they should all be recorded and maintained. In the event that something happens or it's one of the things that are going to be asked. First off, who's the supervisor in charge or person in charge of this workplace? What type of safe work procedures were put in place to mitigate these hazards that were identified? What type of training that was provided for the workers to enter this space and all that sort of stuff. It's important to keep records. And people will probably ask, how long do you keep records for? It depends on what you're dealing with. I know that, for asbestos, they say 30 years record keeping. There's other time frames that for WMIS, 3 years, records of review for SDS sheets, stuff like that. That's been changed now. It's pretty much all the time whenever changes happen. And it's the responsibility, for example, of the supplier, stuff like that. So
we actually just had someone else weigh in here on what they thought a qualified person would be in determining this information.
Sure, that's great.
And yeah. So, we're all in here trying to figure this out, and this is a great definition. As for qualified, at minimum, as a company, you'd want to be able to validate whomever you've deemed qualified, which is important, right?
Yep.
In due diligence matched with reasonably practical, you may choose someone who is familiar, trained, or certified. And it's on the employer to make that determination. And that's so true. And that's, I think, where the challenge lies sometimes is that that's a lot of gray area. Because different organizations deem different people qualified. Some people are going to take this high level thing and they're going to say Joe's qualified now, right? So it's important that you can validate. That's a fantastic point that you can validate that.
It is. No, definitely. Thank you for bringing that up, because it also brings up the as the employer deems a person, if they promote someone into a supervisor position sort of thing, it's scary in the sense in my previous employment, I did a lot of safety for supervisor training. And the one thing that you want to make sure is that, people that are put in these positions are put in these positions to succeed. So they're provided with the appropriate information. So one of those things is that you want to make sure from a legislative standpoint, they understand what they're responsible for. So it comes back also to the training. So you can say that, based on, okay, this person is qualified in this such area, but they need to understand, okay, well, what does this mean? Like, am I actually qualified? So you have to ask those questions just to make sure, to protect yourself, obviously, and also protect the workers that report to you and the operations that you oversee. So this concludes the webinar portion. So I'm not sure if there's some time for some questions or discussion.
You know what? We finished right on time. We got 5 minutes. We've been doing really good. We've been asking or answering all the questions as they came up. But this is a great time, guys, to kind of open round table. We all have different backgrounds in here. We're all trying to figure this out to keep people safe. So we'll kind of keep it open here for the next 5 minutes and discuss any questions, comments, concerns that you have. No? Okay, I'm going to stop the